In March of 1887, a 28-year-old widower named Theodore Roosevelt rode north from Medora to the ranch he owned on the Little Missouri River. The cattle he had left behind the previous August numbered around 5,000. When he reached the Elkhorn, there were carcasses along the river in piles, frozen into the willows where the animals had walked in the last hours of their lives looking for something to eat. He counted what was still walking. It was about a third of what he had owned 6 months earlier. Over 4 years, he had invested about $82,000 in 1880s money. Most of it was gone. He rode back to Medora and wrote a letter to his sister saying the cattle business was done for him. He did not mention that the ranch was also where he had spent the 2 years after his wife and his mother had both died in the same house on the same afternoon. Theodore Roosevelt had come to the Badlands in September of 1883 at age 24 on a hunting trip. He was then a New York State Assemblyman and a well-known name in Republican politics. But he was also a young man with an itch to shoot a buffalo before the buffalo were gone. On that trip, he bought into a cattle ranch operated by a Canadian named Sylvain Ferris and a Minnesota partner named Bill Merrifield. The operation was called the Maltese Cross. Roosevelt put up $14,000, went home to Albany, and kept working in the legislature. On February 14, 1884, inside the same brownstone house in New York City, Roosevelt's wife Alice died of Bright's disease and childbirth complications 2 days after delivering his first daughter, and his mother Martha died of typhoid fever on the same day in a bedroom upstairs from Alice's. In his journal that night, he drew a large X over the page and wrote the sentence, "The light has gone out of my life." He was 25 years old. A few months later, he left his infant daughter with his sister and went back to the Badlands, and he stayed there for most of the next 2 years. The Badlands in 1884 were a country for a man who did not want to be recognized. The nearest telegraph was in Medora, and it was not reliable. Mail arrived by stagecoach twice a week. Roosevelt lived at the Maltese Cross first, in a 2-room cabin shared with Sylvain Ferris and Bill Merrifield. And he did the same work the other 2 men did, which was riding, branding, counting, and hauling. He was nearsighted and wore glasses that were constantly dirty. He was small compared to the men around him and spoke in a high voice with a New York accent that the cowhands mocked for the first few weeks and then stopped mocking because he took the mockery without complaint and outworked most of them. By the end of 1884, he was respected on the Little Missouri in a way that his political career in New York had never gotten him respected. In the summer of 1884, he founded a second ranch, the Elkhorn, about 35 miles north of Medora, in a stretch of the Little Missouri Valley that had cottonwood bottoms and a clear view of the bluffs on the east bank. He hired 2 friends from Maine, Bill Sewall and Wilmot Dow, to build the ranch house and manage the cattle. Sewall was a Penobscot River guide Roosevelt had met on a bear hunt in 1878. Dow was Sewall's nephew. They built a 1.5-story log house, 60 feet long, with a stone chimney at each end and a porch on the east side facing the river. Roosevelt wrote at a desk on the porch in the summers. In the winters, he slept inside, in a small room at the back, on a cot under a buffalo robe. The cattle operation at the Elkhorn was open range. This was how cattle were run in the northern plains in the 1880s. Herds were branded and then let loose across thousands of square miles of unfenced public land. In the fall, cowboys rode the range for weeks, gathering the cattle for shipment to slaughterhouses in Chicago. In between, the animals foraged on native grasses. A shelter was the cottonwood bottoms along the rivers. Winter feed was whatever the cows could dig up through the snow. The assumption was that the grasses of the northern plains would carry cattle through any winter the way they had carried buffalo for 10,000 years. The assumption held until the summer of 1886. That summer was dry. Rainfall across Montana and western Dakota was below normal from May through September. The grass that came up in the spring was thin, and it did not grow back after the early cutting. By August, the ranges were shorter than anyone could remember, and the cattle were already losing weight in a month when they were supposed to be putting it on. The ranchers who had been in the country longest, men like Granville Stewart in central Montana, wrote in their journals that they did not like what they were seeing. Stewart had been running cattle on the Judith Basin since 1879, and he was considered the most experienced cattleman in Montana. His journal for August 1886 describes thin grass, falling weights, and a concern that the coming winter would find his herds underweight. He wrote what he saw and kept riding. Through that fall of 1886, Roosevelt was absent. He had gone back east in September for what he expected to be a short visit. He ran for mayor of New York City in November, placed third, and began planning a second marriage to Edith Caro, a childhood friend from his sister's circle. He did not expect the winter in the Badlands to be anything that would require his attention. The Elkhorn was in the hands of Sewall and Dow. The cattle were on the open range, and the ranchers around Medora had been through hard winters before. On the night of November 16, 1886, the first sign came that this winter was going to be unusual. An ice storm moved down across the northern plains from Canada. It did not drop much snow. It dropped a layer of freezing rain that coated the remaining grass and the ground underneath with a sheet of clear ice a quarter-inch thick. The cattle on the open range could no longer reach the grass with their hooves or their muzzles. The ice did not melt for a week. By the time it did, a first snowstorm had already arrived. 2 more blizzards crossed the region in December. Drifts piled 15 feet deep in the coulees and the cottonwood bottoms. The cattle moved into the willows along the rivers because there was no other shelter. January brought a cold that stayed below zero for most of the month and dropped to 40 below in long stretches. A storm at the end of January dropped snow at the rate of an inch an hour for 16 hours. The cattle that had not already starved were standing in drifts that covered their legs to the belly and were eating the bark off the cottonwood trees in the river bottoms. The bark was not enough. The trees around Roosevelt's ranch house were stripped bare for 6 feet above the snow line by February. A cowboy at the Elkhorn named Bill Merrifield later said that the cattle did not bellow during the cold. They stood in the trees and made no sound, and that was the part he could not forget. Roosevelt was not at the Elkhorn during the worst of it. He had married Edith Caro in London in December. He was in Europe on his honeymoon through most of January. The dispatches from the Dakotas did not reach him in a way that conveyed what was happening. He assumed the losses would be manageable. He was writing letters that month about literary projects and political friends, and was not yet thinking about what he would find when he went back. Granville Stewart in Montana was at his ranch through the whole winter. His journal entries from January of 1887 are brief because he was writing them with cold hands in a room where the ink froze in the pen. He recorded the temperatures. He recorded the snowfall. He recorded the number of cattle counted dead that day. He did not write commentary. On one page, there is a line about a horse that walked to the door of the bunkhouse at sundown and stood there without moving, and the line does not say what happened to the horse after that. The entries get shorter as the month goes on. The handwriting gets tighter. By the end of January, the page for the day is sometimes just a temperature and a number. He reached Medora in March. The snow was still deep in the coulees. He rode north along the river toward the Elkhorn with Bill Sewall and a crew of cowboys, and the first stretch of the ride was through carcasses. Dead cattle were piled in the cottonwoods. Dead cattle were caught in the willows along the bank. dead cattle were frozen into the ice of the river itself, standing where they had gone in looking for water and been unable to climb back out. The cowboys at the Elkhorn had been riding the range for 3 weeks, trying to count living animals. The count when Roosevelt arrived was that somewhere between 50 and 60% of his herd was gone, and the survivors were so thin they could be pushed over by a man on foot. Granville Stewart in Montana, on his much larger operation, had lost 72%. Pierre Weibo, another rancher in eastern Dakota, had lost over 50%. The Marquis de Morès, Roosevelt's showman neighbor at Medora, was ruined. Across Montana, Wyoming, and Dakota Territory, the industry-wide losses were later estimated at between 60 and 80% of all cattle on the northern plains. Some of the smaller outfits lost everything. The bankers who had lent money against the cattle as collateral called in their loans in the spring of 1887 and found that the collateral was lying dead in the coulees. The open-range cattle industry, as it had been practiced in the northern plains since the early 1870s, ended in the winter of 1886 to 1887. It did not ramp down over a decade. It ended in a single season. Ranchers who continued to run cattle after that winter did it with fenced land, cut hay, winter feed stored in barns, and smaller herds on private deeded ground. The model that had made a small number of men rich in the first half of the 1880s, the model that had assumed the plains would feed cattle for free the way they had fed buffalo, was not available after the Big Die-Up, which was the name the survivors gave to what had happened. The inversion in this story is not about Theodore Roosevelt losing money. Losing money is what happens to bad cattle investments in bad winters. The inversion is about what the winter ended. A specific theory of land held by a specific group of investors had been tested by a specific weather event, and the theory had failed. The theory was that the northern plains were an inexhaustible pasture that could be run as a commons without improvement or investment in shelter or feed. The winter showed the theory to be wrong in a way that left bodies in the cottonwoods. The young New Yorker who walked among those bodies in March of 1887 had been, up to that point, a man who believed that nature was something to be hunted, sold, and converted into profit. He came out of that march a man who had started to think that nature was something that could be used up by people who were not paying attention, and that the government had a role in preventing that. He did not arrive at his conservation politics immediately. It took another 15 years and a presidency and the political education that came with them. But the men who worked for him at the Elkhorn noticed a change in him during the summer of 1887. He talked less about the cattle and more about the land. He talked about the thin grass from the summer before and what he would have done if he had known, and what a country could do to protect its own ground from a generation of men who treated it the way the cattlemen had. In 1905, as president, he would sign the legislation that established the United States Forest Service, and by the end of his presidency, he would have protected around 230 million acres of public land. The number is large, and the land is in many states, and not all of it was grazed open range. But the pattern of it traces back to what he saw in the willows along the Little Missouri River in March of 1887. The physical Elkhorn ranch house remained standing for a few more years. In the summer of 1887, Roosevelt spent a few months at it, tying up the operation and helping Sewall and Dow decide what to do next. Sewall, who had never been comfortable on the plains, took his family back to Maine that year. Dow had died the previous spring at the Elkhorn from complications of a respiratory illness that had started the winter before the Big Die-Up and that the cold had made worse. Roosevelt was not at the ranch when Dow died. He found out by telegram in New York. The grave is on a rise above the Little Missouri, not far from the ranch house foundations, and is one of the few physical markers of the human cost of the winter beyond the carcasses themselves. Wilmot Dow was 34 years old when he died. He had gone west from Maine 4 years earlier, because his uncle had gone west and had said the country needed good hands. He had built the Elkhorn ranch house with his own tools, logs sized and notched the way he had learned to size and notch logs on the Penobscot River. The house he built outlasted him by only a few seasons. Roosevelt sold out of the Badlands gradually across the next several years. The Maltese Cross was wound down first. The Elkhorn was held longer, partly for sentiment and partly because he wanted to make sure that Sewall and Dow and the other men who had worked for him did not take losses they could not recover from. By 1890, the Elkhorn was also gone, and the ranch house stood empty. A local family lived in it for a few years afterward. The logs were scavenged for other buildings in the 1890s. By 1901, the year Roosevelt became president, there was nothing left of the house but the stone foundations and the chimney stones on the ground. The Elkhorn Ranch site is now part of Theodore Roosevelt National Park. A visitor can walk along the river where the cattle died and stand on the foundations of the cabin where Roosevelt slept under a buffalo robe, in a room that cost him everything he had put into it. The cottonwoods along the bank are different trees than the ones that were stripped for 6 feet above the snow by starving cows, because the cottonwoods from that winter did not all survive either. The ones that did are old now, and the ones that grew in their place are about 130 years old, which is the age of a cottonwood that remembers nothing and the age of a landscape that remembers everything. The park rangers who give tours at the Elkhorn site sometimes point out the bark scars that show on the oldest surviving cottonwoods at about 6 feet above the current ground level. Those scars are not from that winter. Cottonwoods that were bark stripped down to living wood in 1887 did not last the decade, but rangers keep mentioning the 6-foot line when they talk about the site because visitors can picture it. A cow standing on a drift, eating bark as high as a man can reach, is the kind of image that does the work a plaque cannot do. The plaques at the site mention the dates and the losses and the names. The image belongs to the visitor, standing under a living cottonwood in the place where the dead ones used to be. Theodore Roosevelt died in January of 1919 at 60 years old at his home on Long Island. He had been out of office for 10 years. His last major book, published shortly before his death, included a chapter about the Dakota Badlands and the cattle years. He described the land, the men, the work, and the winter. He did not dwell on the financial ruin. He dwelled on the willows and the cottonwood bottoms and the silence of the cattle in the cold, and he wrote that the silence had stayed with him for the rest of his life. The last thing Roosevelt wrote about the Elkhorn in his memoirs decades later was that the ranch had taught him more than any other experience of his life. He did not specify what. He specified the winter. He wrote that the winter had ruined him financially and had been the making of him as a man who understood what the land required. He wrote it as a straightforward sentence with no adjectives, because by the time he wrote it, he was the kind of man who had learned that the weight of what had happened was in the event and not in the word. If you want more stories like this one, the full playlist is right here.